The following program is brought to you by the University of Alabama.
The beautiful, talented, troubled Zelda Fitzgerald of Montgomery, Alabama, was movie star famous in the 1920s and is again a pop culture idol, due in part to Woody Allen's film Midnight in Paris. The novelist, Therese Fowler, decided to let Zelda tell her story in her own voice, from the inside, to show what it was like to be Zelda Fitzgerald. I spoke with Therese Fowler at the studios of Alabama Public Television in Montgomery, Alabama.
Therese, it's good to see you.
I'm delighted to be here.
It took me a little while to learn properly. It's not Teresa, it's not Teresa, it's not Therese. You like Therese.
That's my parents' choice, and I'm stuck with it.
Well, Ms. Fowler, it's good that you were able to come. You are on a tour now because your novel about starring Zelda Fitzgerald is a big hit, and you're traveling around talking about your novel. But since this is the first time you've traveled to Bookmark, let's talk about your life up until this point. This new novel is very Southern in its origins anyway, and you've set a novel in Florida, but you're not any kind of Southerner, really.
A transplanted Southerner.
Where did you start out?
I am from Illinois originally. I grew up there and was there until I think 1986. I had married a fellow who joined the Air Force, and we went off to the Philippines for 3 years. And that was the last time that I lived in the Midwest.
And then now you're in North Carolina.
I am now, have been since 1995.
I was looking at your academic career, and there's a lot of it all together.
Yes, that's right.
Where did you go to undergraduate school?
At North Carolina State.
And then also for the MFA there?
Yes, after a break in between.
And what did you do during the break?
I wrote a novel, yeah, and I did a lot of volunteer work at my kids' schools. It was the first time that I'd had any freedom to experiment with the idea of writing fiction. And I took advantage of that and wrote what I call my practice novel in that period of time, and then decided that grad school would give me a real education in writing.
And I would have bet $50 yesterday that you studied with Lee Smith or with Jill McCorkle, and I'm wrong.
No, I know.
Who did you study with?
Who was on faculty then? John Kessel, Wilton Barnhart, John Balaban, Elaine Orr, a number of really terrific literature professors, but those were the writing faculty.
Did you study with Lucinda McKeithen?
No, I never took a class with her. No, I know some of my friends adore her, but I didn't have that opportunity either.
Well, she knows a lot about Zelda.
Probably should have started with her had I known.
And Linda Wagner over at Chapel Hill knows a lot about Zelda.
Yes, I read her biography.
So you were in the midst of it. Zelda is this new book of yours, Z, came out, hit the bestseller list right off the bat at number 10. And a lot of people mistakenly thought, well, here is a debut novel that's just taken off like mad, but it's your fourth novel.
That's right.
Fourth published novel.
Right.
Not even counting
the practice novel and a few others that are in the drawer.
There are a couple of, your earlier novels are all contemporary. That is to say, they are novels. How far back is the earliest one? 2004 or 2000? I mean, they're
yeah,
really
not very far back.
21st century novels.
Yes, very much so.
And Souvenir, was Souvenir your first published book?
Yes, first published book.
There are a couple things about that, and then moving in from there to exposure as well. There are a couple of things that you take up. One of the things, you were compared by some people to The Notebook.
The marketing angle for that.
Yeah.
Nicholas Sparks' version of a story because it was a tragic love story,
right.
Souvenir. Yeah.
We take these one at a time, though. One of the things that happens in your books is there's a moment when people make a decision, which they often regret.
Yes.
And another thing is that they often get a chance to reunite. People seen not only in reunion, but in Souvenir as well.
Yeah, that's true.
And they're love stories. You have a theory about love, do you?
Oh, well, Shakespeare had the best theory about love, I think. It is the force that powers all of our relationships. It's not just romantic love that I'm interested in. I'm interested in familial love and self-love, and the sacrifices that people make for the people that they care most about, the sacrifices that they're willing to make in order to find happiness for themselves. It's very messy and complicated.
Do you believe in love at first sight? Some of your characters do.
I believe in infatuation, certainly. Enduring love at first sight, I think, may be just a function of luck.
And what about, it's a seminar on love for some reason, what about young love? You seem to give it a lot more credence than a lot of people would.
I think people who don't forget what it was like to be in love when they were young. That is the most intense, I think, experience of love that any of us have. And it's so formative. And for that reason, a lot of what happens in my earlier books, and actually in Z as well, really, is those early love relationships, the way that they power the choices that follow, is something that I think is intrinsically human, something that we share universally.
So when young people tell their parents that at the age of 19, say, hypothetically 19, that they found the one, we should believe them?
We should believe that they believe that they have found the one. I made the mistake myself. I got married when I was 18, my first marriage, and I was absolutely convinced that I knew what I was doing. And no one in my life said otherwise, which I think it's good because I have two wonderful sons from that marriage, but perhaps bad because getting married when you're that young, I think, is almost never a good idea.
Well, life is just full of paradoxes, isn't it?
Yes.
Money, I mean, if we're going to have a seminar on love, we've got to have a seminar on money too.
Of course.
And the place where they meet is interesting. It's not, you're not writing Romeo and Juliet in the sense of warring families or quarreling families, but in your novels it will happen that the families are very unequal in financial power, and the sacrifice that Meg?
In Souvenir,
in
yeah.
Souvenir, the sacrifice that she makes. She marries Brian sort of to save the family from, it's kind of like, it's not melodrama, it's not like you're going to be thrown out into the blizzard or something.
Right.
But she does it.
Yeah, she's the oldest daughter in a family that has had its share of struggles. Her father is this lovely, a little bit scattered fellow who has been trying to make good but hasn't quite succeeded and is in a great lot of debt. And she has, a friendship with a young man who has greater interest in her than she has in him, but his family has the ability to help undo her family's troubles. And because she is this very responsible oldest daughter of this, sometimes unwise man.
Good man, though.
Yes.
Yeah, he's a good fellow.
She thinks that she's going
bad businessman.
She's going to rescue them, and she doesn't understand because she's so young the kind of sacrifice that she's making, for her own interests.
Yeah. I thought it was wonderfully, ironic in the best sense that Carson, the boy she leaves behind, turns out to be a multi-millionaire rock and roll
right? He's the
star.
Success.
The other thing in that novel, and you, it's almost unspeakable, but you give your heroine Lou Gehrig's disease. You give your heroine ALS, for which there is no remedy.
Right.
I've read a lot of novels in my life, and I don't know that I've ever read one in which a character had ALS. What prompted you to go in that direction?
My husband has a very close friend whose daughter was suffering from ALS at the time that I was conceiving this novel. And so there were certain things in their situation that prompted me to think about, what would happen. And in her case, she had a husband who also was not so tremendously equipped to handle the situation. And it's a horrible disease,
yes.
and a horrible situation to find oneself in. And this is, I guess, what we do as writers. We take something that is really difficult and imagine it in a way that helps us understand how we can deal with these sorts of things in life. I mean, you don't bother to write a novel about a happy situation. At least I don't tend to so far.
All happy families are more or less alike.
Exactly.
In two of the early novels, there's a reunion novel, but people are often reunited in your books, which I think is a good thing, a very hopeful thing. But one of the elements of the contemporary in your books is the influence on young people these days of what I guess we loosely call social media. Mm. And in Exposure, which is a title that gives a little bit away, a boy and a girl are in love. They are Romeo and Juliet. They are deeply in love. They send each other pictures. Her father finds the pictures, and all hell breaks loose.
Right.
What prompted you to go down that road?
Well, I'd like to say it all was from my imagination, but unfortunately this one also was inspired by an incident that was even closer to home than the one that kind of evolved into Souvenir. My oldest son was unwisely sharing some photos of himself with a young lady, and her father discovered them. And in his case, that is not what happens in Exposure, but it prompted a sort of what if question. I mean, my son was arrested, and he and I and the rest of the family, we spent a number of tense months waiting to see how things were going to resolve. In his case, he wasn't in love with the girl. It was an amusement, which is so often the way teenagers are dealing with this kind of sexuality and sharing of private information. But I thought, what if he had been in love with this girl and had been forced apart by these circumstances? And that was what led me to write the book.
There's a wonderful scene in Murder on the Orient Express where Hercule Poirot is sitting in a bar in Istanbul with an old friend of his, and they're watching 20-somethings dance, and Poirot says to his old friend, "Oh, my friend, thank God we are no longer young."
Exactly.
I mean, it just looks difficult and exhausting.
Indeed, I wouldn't go back.
But you've moved now, you've published your fourth novel, it's a big hit, and it's a first-person narrative. Your heroine is Zelda.
That's right.
About whom much is known and about whom much is argued and controversial. Why did you decide that you wanted to write from Zelda's point of view? And what is it about Zelda that just is endlessly interesting to people?
Well, about why she's interesting, because this is part of what brought me to the project in the first place, is, here was a woman who was way ahead of her time in many ways. To be a privileged, although not so much financially privileged, but socially privileged child who seems to have been kind of a wild wanton, in her youth, was more unusual than not in the early 1900s. And then she went on to live this astonishing life, from a very young age, very unwisely marrying, a fellow who didn't have a traditional, career ahead of him. Something about the two of them being at the frontier, I think, makes her very interesting, sure, just in that sense. And then because he became such a success, and because their lives became this carnival of places and people and excess, it'd be fascinating even if they were alive today. Right. But it's more exceptional because of the era in which it occurred.
If I were to get just tragically simple-minded, and I were to say, Zelda would have been all right, it was Scott who drove her crazy, or Scott would have been all right. It was Zelda who ruined him.
No.
Where do you, is this, it's obviously, she may have been bipolar, but this is not a polarity. Somewhere on this continuum is what happened. What do you think happened?
Right, a lot of things happened. A lot of things happened, and as is true in life, one thing affects the next thing, and so you get this set of circumstances and these people with their strengths and their weaknesses, and then things either go well or they don't. And no, neither one of them, I think, is to blame for the disaster that their lives became, and both of them are to blame.
It's almost like some kind of unholy, perfect chemical mix that the right ingredients got poured in there, and then there was some years of great joy and a lot of pain.
Yes.
There's a place in your novel where Zelda is ruminating about why her marriage was ruined, and she said, I know why my marriage was ruined. It was Ernest Hemingway's fault.
He's to blame, she says.
Yes, he's to blame. Why is he to blame?
Well, a little bit of background for folks. It's widely acknowledged that Hemingway and Zelda had terrific animosity for each other. What's so interesting about that relationship to me was that there was a time when Hemingway and the Fitzgeralds were first acquainted, when it was a very warm, give and take between all of them. Yeah. And then there comes this point in time when it's no longer that way. And so I was very interested in that question of what started the animosity. And of course we have a theory that's presented in the novel. But Hemingway became, we think of him as this larger than life person even today, but as he was at that time, he had tremendous personality, and he had a big effect on Scott. And as Scott and Zelda began developing more of their problems, partly it was because of Hemingway's influence, and then partly Hemingway's influence exacerbated those problems. And so from Zelda's perspective, and I'm not necessarily making that argument myself, but I believe that she was absolutely persuaded that he was to blame for everything that followed. Not for, entirely, but...
You generate a scene in your novel in which explains, so to speak, the switch for Hemingway having a certain amount of affection for Zelda to Hemingway becoming an adversary of Zelda. And you think this is now a fictional scene, which you created, of course, as novelists are supposed to do. He came onto her, he was rejected, and this hurt his ego. That's all logical, by the way.
Well, again, it's sort of a result of deductive reasoning. Who was Zelda at the time? Who was Hemingway at the time? What kinds of things could possibly have occurred? And we kind of narrow it down to that.
There isn't a world of time, but it's interesting you could have written a biography of Zelda, or you could have written a novel about a person named Thelma, based on, as every reader would identify, Zelda Fitzgerald. But what is the special responsibility, maybe, of writing what is clearly a work of fiction, but the people in it are known quantities with collected letters and biographies and so on? That's an interesting, a dangerous path to take.
Well, it can be dangerous, certainly. People do wonder. They say, why not just write another biography, for example? And, I think that's a legitimate question, but what happens for people like myself, we novelists, when we come upon a bit of information, it's sort of there. It's facts, it's figures, it's a timeline. And it's interesting, but we want to know the inner landscape of the situation. We want the story of the emotions. To tell those stories about real people is risky, but it's also a wonderful privilege. And there's a certain responsibility that goes along with doing that, which I took very seriously. I tried to stick to the established record as much as it can be determined, and as you said at the beginning of this, there are a lot of divergent opinions about the Fitzgeralds. But to represent the essence, even if not every minute fact is what I attempted to do. I hope I have
Well,
succeeded in doing.
It's almost, I mean, although I have a tendency to do this, I would put words in your mouth actually if I could, but it's truth rather than fact. I mean, when you created something that you thought Zelda was thinking and feeling, we don't know if she was actually thinking and feeling it. It seems right to you, though.
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you something that happened to me while I was reading the book. And when I realized it was happening, I thought, oh, dummy. There are long scenes like the car trip from Lyon back to Paris with Scott and Hemingway. And there's a lot of stuff in Hollywood that I really, really like. And I said, why isn't this in the book? And then I thought, well, it can't be in the book. Zelda wasn't there.
Zelda wasn't there.
How did you?
That's right.
What was your? I know if I had been writing your book, which I didn't, I would have been tempted to have Scott report back or something. How did you deal with that in the process of moving through the book?
Certainly, those stories, some of them are so well understood
Yes.
that I didn't feel like I would be adding anything to the conversation by including them. Part of the trouble is just there's so much to choose from.
Right.
They chronicled their own lives so extensively. Biographers have chronicled their lives even more so. You have to pick and choose.
Mm-hmm.
And so partly because Zelda wasn't present, and partly because if we're in Zelda's point of view,
Right.
she isn't as focused on what happened on that trip that Hemingway spends so much time on in A
Right.
Movable Feast. That's not her concern, especially not when the book is set in 1940. It's an organic process. I can't necessarily explain it all.
No, it makes perfect sense. It really does. You can't. I mean, what you would have, if you had chosen to get those stories told, you would have had to create a telling, a reporting, a letter,
Right.
conversation late at night.
More mechanical, right?
Yeah, but people do.
Yes.
How old is? What are the circumstances of Zelda's telling of this story? She is.
The story opens with a prologue in
Yeah.
1940, in December of 1940. She has been out of the Highland Hospital in Asheville for about 8 months and is living in Montgomery here with her mother.
Right.
That's the frame of the story.
Right.
And then she goes back to sort of the beginning of her story with Scott. So it's not the beginning of her life, but the beginning of their journey together.
Yeah. You didn't waste a lot of time with her high school adventures.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I mean, people can read the biographies and
You think that's known?
I don't know that it's necessarily known by people who haven't read the biographies, but I think, again, what would Zelda have been wanting to convey when she's telling this story?
Yeah.
I don't think she would have talked a lot about high school.
So what do you think now, after giving it a million hours of your time, what was wrong with her? What was her condition?
Oh boy, well, beyond the
I mean, if she were
biochemical.
diagnosed today, how would she be diagnosed and how would she be treated?
Well, as I understand it, she probably would be bipolar, and I know there are a lot of effective medications to help manage those swings from the manic to the depression. Other than that, some of her problems were just that she was unwise, or she was naive, or she was too eager, or she was impatient. Any and all of the above. And then by the time she had the wisdom that would have helped her deal with some of those things, most of them were already done.
And the treatments were, the more one
treatments were
learns
awful.
about the treatments of the 20s and 30s, the more brutal it all seems. Well, if a person has recently learned that there were 3 novels before Z, one is sure there will be novels after Z.
Indeed.
What do you think is the next thing you want to do?
It's hard to talk about something that isn't written yet, but I have an idea.
Yeah.
I have a story inspired by not real people in this case, but a very powerful work of fiction that I won't go into the details right now, but I'm very eager to get started on that.
Is it going to be like the earlier ones, set in the 21st century?
No, I have changed direction with my career. Those first novels were kind of a learning process for me, how to be a writer sort of in public. I feel like I'm really grasping the kinds of stories that I want to tell now. And so staying in a historical mode and moving, in a similar direction.
Right. Well, I have enjoyed your works, and I'm looking forward to the next ones. And I know you're looking forward to a couple more days in Montgomery where you will explore more Fitzgeraldiana.
Yeah, Fitzgeraldalia, as I say. Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a pleasure.
Me too.
To order this season of Bookmark on DVD, call 1-800-463-8825. Additional information can be found on our website at www.alabamatv.org.